Hey guys, how we doing? Jake Affronti here, over with DSD Arizona, working with Arizona Christian University. I'm the associate director of performance over here. I'm working with 10 of the teams and assisting with football. So the teams I work with, just to give you some background, I work with men's and women's soccer, men's and women's golf, track and field, men's lacrosse, women's wrestling, women's basketball, cheer, and dance. So I have a lot of the teams over here. Today, I'm presenting to you on microdosing speed training and team environment. Now, for some of you that were on the original presentation, you'll notice that these slide decks look a lot better. So I appreciate y'all holding me accountable and getting me better as it relates to some of the presentations that I do. So, with microdosing in the team environment, as it relates to speed, a little mantra, a little theme that I like to think about is high output, low fatigue, and sustainable speed. So, as we go through what this looks like, here's just kind of the overview. What is microdosing? We're going to define it as well as a couple of other terms. What's the problem we're trying to solve here? We're not just doing microdosing just to do microdosing. We're trying to solve a problem. Why speed responds to microdosing? Some key principles where microdosing fits in team environments, weekly microdose template, as well as some takeaways. So, what is microdosing? Microdosing training is defined as the division of total volume within a microcycle across frequent, short duration, repeated bouts. So you're going to hear me talk a little bit more about your traditional speed session versus what a microdose session could look like. And instead of it being basically, this is the main takeaway, instead of it being 90 minutes or let's just say 45 minutes, now we're looking at 10, 15 minutes per session, uh, more frequent throughout the week rather than just maybe one or two sessions. While I was doing some research, I found that a lot of folks were using microdosing synonymously with some other terms, or at least one other term. But before I dive into what that term is, I think it's very important to understand when you're talking about microdosing, you also want to understand what residual training effects are. So when we define residual training effects, we look at the length of time a physiological or performance adaptation is retained after you reduce or stop direct training for that quality. Different athletic qualities consisting of speed, power, and strength decline at different rates once specific training stimulus is removed. Some of this might be like a detraining effect, right? We'll talk a little bit more about that. But the other term that I was referring to is minimum effective dose. Having an understanding of what a minimum effective dose is only going to allow you to program better from a microdosing perspective. And what minimum effective dose is the smallest amount of training stimulus needed to elicit a meaningful adaptive response while minimizing unnecessary fatigue and waste volume. So, understanding those definitions, let's talk a little bit about the problem we're solving. As it relates to what I do here at Arizona Christian with DSD Arizona is 10 teams assist with football, but we also have, I think, 24 teams currently, and we're adding 4 more. Now, if you haven't been to our weight room, you'll walk into the weight room and you're going to be like, wow, this is really cool. Don't get me wrong. It is pretty cool. It's in a 1940s World War II hangar. But it's limited in space and how we do things. Now, coming from the first 2 bullet points, having a shared space with 28 different teams with limited times makes things challenging from a programming perspective, right? Just assume that things aren't going to be perfect, but you as a coach now have to flex some of the strengths on how to be adaptive and utilize the best possible way the equipment that you have available to you, the space that you have available to you, and ultimately the athlete that you have available to you. Because again, Arizona Christian University is also an NAIA college, right? So more often than not, these are the conversations that the staff and we have conversations about training ages. And it's not even with NAIA, by the way. You know, I was at a conference, not a conference, but a presentation from Arizona State's head football strength coach, Joe Connolly, and he was even stating, hey, I don't know what these athletes do when they're in high school, and more often than not, they don't have a strength coach, so I have to treat them with a training age as 0. So they go through, obviously, their Block 0 program just to ensure that they're caught up to speed from a movement perspective. Now, again, going back to the problem we're solving as it relates to microdosing speed, large rosters, right? My track and field team is 60 total. We might have both my track and field team in there as well as Rick's softball team in there. So instead of 60 athletes, now we're looking at maybe 70. With one of our football groups, we might have a total of 90 athletes in there, right? So how are we programming from a large rosters perspective, and how are we prioritizing it? Now you're going to see basic fundamentals of programming, right? Understanding how you prioritize the hierarchy of what specific attribute that you're trying to develop. There's science behind that, but thinking about it from this perspective, you might see some different ways to prioritize that and get creative. Now, the problem here from a typical results perspective, I've been doing this for 15 years. So I've seen plenty of different coaching staffs. I've seen plenty of different ways the sausage gets made, right? When it comes to time constraints and not having the ability to get done what needs to get done, that's where sport coaches specifically start to prioritize what they need, which as they should, right? If you have a soccer team and your athlete can't really play soccer, that's probably going to be a huge problem, a huge glaring problem. But as performance coaches, it's our responsibility to develop better relationships with our sport coaches to ensure that they are still considering performance, right? The speed, strength, power, size, all of that stuff, all of those attributes. They're still considering all those things while they're planning out what everything looks like. So, problem we're solving is from all of the above characteristics that I just described, speed sometimes becomes lower on the totem pole, especially if you have a sport coach that thinks, oh, well, we do enough of that during practice anyway. Yeah, you might do enough of that during practice. But what's the intent behind what you're doing in practice? Are you sprinting, but you're treating it more as like conditioning? Is it at the very tail end of your practice session after a 2-hour long practice session? Are you squeezing in 5-10 minutes for athletes to do something called gassers, right? If you're on a football field, you're running from sideline to sideline 3 or 4 times. Are you doing the full length of the field instead of doing short sprints from an acceleration deceleration perspective, 10 yards, 20 yards? Are you doing 100 yards? Are you doing 200 yards? Right? Speed tends to become conditioning when coaches actually think they're training speed. Another big one is you might actually see it just disappear altogether. I've been at some programs to where, hey, unfortunately, sport coaches take up a massive amount of time. And again, we're at the tail end of the session. We're just like, oh, wait, we got to do some sort of conditioning, or we still need to get our speed work in. And you know, when you're looking at the kids, the athletes, and you're saying like they're dog tired, they're pretty gassed, they're wasted already from that practice, it might just say, hey, you know what, we'll get it tomorrow. And then all of a sudden a behavior happens to where this happens every single time. And you're developing this bad behavior to where now speed actually just becomes absent and it's non-existent. Another characteristic would be, or a result, I should say, is something else becomes absent, right? We may prioritize speed, but now instead of doing speed, or excuse me, now that we're doing speed, since we only made time for that, now we're not really focused on the power development. Now we're not really focused on strength development. Now we don't really care about the size, things along those lines. So that's ultimately the problem that we're trying to solve when it comes to the concept of microdosing. And again, we'll dive a little bit deeper in specifics about how it relates to speed. So why speed responds to microdosing? Talked about a couple slides ago, the residual training effects. as it relates to speed. One of the studies that I found, which was pretty interesting, stated the repeated sprint test, RST, performance was reduced after the 1 week detraining period in the present study. So conventional wisdom and science tells you that speed, out of all of the other characteristics and abilities that you were going to train, power, strength, size, has the shortest window of opportunity from a detraining perspective. So if we sprinted on Monday, we didn't touch sprinting until the following Monday, that actually might be a detraining window. So an athlete might be in this loop where you think you're doing your sprinting on Monday and that's enough. This athlete might be in a loop to where, hey, even though I'm sprinting every Monday, I might not be eliciting the adaptation that I need to actually progress. That might be more of a maintenance thing. Now, that's all things considered, all things being equal. Some athletes, especially those with lower training age, they might still elicit a response. They might still have a positive response to just sprinting on Monday. But as we start getting higher in our training age, that might change. A takeaway that I thought was interesting as well was even though isolated maximal sprint times sometimes don't decrease immediately, kind of what I was talking about, depends on some variables, measures that reflect real world speed capacity, like repeated sprints or fatigue resistance, do show decline after just 1 week without specific training stimulus. So that just emphasizes how important it is that we have frequent exposures to specific speed work. As far as microdose speed goes, another study that I found, which was interesting, shorter, more frequent sprint and plyometric sessions produce similar adaptations to traditional training volumes, supporting the idea that a minimal but strategically distributed dose can be sufficient. That's a massive one. And I mean, if there was any quote that you took away from this presentation, it might just be that one, because there are studies that are showing, hey, instead of doing a 75, 45, 60, 90-minute speed session, like a traditional training would look like, depending on my athlete, I would look at that and say, you know what, maybe we should break this down 10, 15 minutes here, 10, 15 minutes here, 10, 15 minutes here. We'll have more frequent exposures to it all and just making sure that we are hammering away some of the adequate rest and recovery principles needed in order for them to obviously elicit a good response. So in addition to that, we're looking at an injury resistance perspective. Another quote that I found was microdosing in this instance may therefore provide more opportunities for motor learning, but it also allows a greater amount of time for other sessions, such as traditional resistance training sessions or recovery between sessions and training days. So going back to that first point, this instance may therefore provide more opportunities for motor learning. Depending on how well versed you are from a programming perspective, Westside Barbell, I don't know if they specifically created this. I'm pretty sure they did. But Westside Barbell talks about some of those 3 different efforts, right? Maximal effort, dynamic effort, and repeated effort. So when we have repeated efforts as it relates to whether speed, strength, power, what have you, the more opportunities that you expose an athlete to that specific exercise, movement, adaptation, what have you, they're going to have a better opportunity to become more crisp, more sharp. They may be able to execute things better because they're repeated efforts that allows them to develop their motor learning regarding that movement. Again, moving forward with that allows a greater amount of time for other sessions, such as traditional resistance sessions or recovery between sessions and training days. Now, this is important, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. But thinking about what I do, right, with Arizona Christian, what Rick does, and what Thad and Jamie do, is not every team comes in a minimum of 3 times a week. 2 of my teams I only see once a week. A handful of my teams I see only twice. I think one or two of my teams I only see 3 times a week. In football, we see 4. We know as professionals that there is a minimum effective dose to just about everything, varies depending on training age. But where I was going with this, I totally lost my train of thought. But going back to such as traditional resistance sessions or recovery between sessions and training days, yeah, totally lost my thought on that. So we're just going to go ahead and disregard where I was going. I think I was going on a tangent, but just understanding that increases the probability that they are going to resist some sort of injury because we have enough recovery time in between. Okay. Going on in line with what we just talked about, microdosing, speed training principles in comparison. So we've talked about this a little bit already, the traditional approach versus the microdose approach. So this kind of gives you some idea, some road work, or excuse me, like a railway, right? How you can kind of approach this. So your traditional approach tends to be 1 to 2 dedicated speed days, tends to be higher volume per session, tends to be greater fatigue accumulation, often removed during differing parts of the season. As far as comparing that to a microdosed approach, instead of 1 to 2, now we're looking at 3 to 5 plus. You're looking at very low volume. So the idea behind the low volume is the fact that, again, you have enough time to recover. That's the biggest thing here, because if you're not getting the high intent behind your speed work, more than likely you're not getting faster. And this is something I talk to my athletes all the time about, is that I understand it's sometimes early in the morning. I understand that you might be stressed out. You didn't sleep well. Maybe you didn't hydrate. Maybe you didn't nourish your body well. But you have to come to a speed session. It's not just speed, by the way, it's everything. You have to come to your training sessions with the highest intention, the baddest intentions, the meanest intentions of you trying to get better athletically. Every sprint, every lift, every plyometric, every exercise that you do, unless specified otherwise, you have to come with that highest intent, that meanest intent that you possibly have. That's how you allow your body to adapt. Minimal fatigue cost, adequate rest. We've talked a little bit about this. It's also embedded into existing structure, right? So often removed during differing parts of the season, usually a time constraint from a traditional approach versus a microdosed approach. It can be embedded into its existing structures. And I'll show you exactly what that looks like, right? Where microdosing fits. Where it fits perfectly is within warmups. If you were to sit there as a coach and think about, hey, what does almost every team do prior to their practice sessions, maybe even a lifting session, anything like that? Everybody does a warm up. How do you incorporate some form of speed work in that warm up? So you have to have structure, understanding, hey, we're going to go through this warm up. It's very intentful, right? We're going to try and increase the blood flow. We're going to try and highlight some of the rhythm and coordination that you do. And as we kind of prime that body to get prepared, prime that nervous system to get prepared, we're also going to sprinkle in some acceleration, 10-yard accelerations. I'm also going to sprinkle in some 10-yard accelerations to decelerations, accelerations to change of directions, maybe a 5-0-5, maybe a T drill, a Y drill, any sort of those types of drills you can sprinkle in here, get some exposures to them, and then move on to whatever they need to from a practice perspective. When we think about lifting, one of the things I always try and do with my programs is, again, order of hierarchy. What is the most important thing that we need to prioritize first right off the gate, and then focus on going down, right? So my A block tends to be some form of speed or power exercise. I want the highest neural producing exercise or movement to be the very first thing that I do. After that, then we transition into our strength work. Then we go into some supplemental strength work, maybe some accessories, depending on what we're looking for. what I just mentioned, right? Placed before skill sessions. So I don't know why I just always think of soccer as it relates to that, right? Hand-eye coordination, hand-foot coordination, or excuse me, eye-foot coordination as it relates to how they dribble, how they move down the field, up and down the field with the soccer ball. Those are very skill-oriented sessions. I want to make sure that this sprinting session happens before all of that, right? We want to make sure that the highest producing CNS movement, by the way, is sprinting, the most coordinated, the most rhythmic, and the highest nervous system stimulating exercise is going to be sprinting. That all happens first, which again, to the last bullet point, CNS primer, that's going to wake you up. As far as the weekly structure goes, you could be looking at 2 to 3 acceleration exposures, 0 to 20 yards per week from a microdose perspective. You could be looking at 1 to 2 max velocity exposures, buildups and flies throughout the week. 1 lift day speed primer, right? So a good example of this is what I'm doing with my men's and women's soccer team. Tuesday, Thursday, we're out on the field for the first, let's say 30, 35 minutes. After we're done with those 35 minutes, I have them put their shoes on. We go jog over to the weight room to still get some form of strength training in. Albeit it's not a significant amount of strength training, but it is something that will still complement what we just did on the field. Typical dosing as it relates to microdosing, 2 to 6 total reps per exposure, right? Because again, last bullet point that I have there, we're only looking at 10 to 15 minutes. That's not a long time. It's not a very long time. You're going through some form of a warm-up that's very intentional. It's not long and drawn out like most warm-ups tend to be. It's very intentional from a warm-up perspective. Keep the body stiff, get the blood flowing, and then go ahead and take off with your microdosed acceleration, max velo, stuff like that. Full recovery between reps. I can't stress this enough. And I say this from my own coaching perspective. You know, when I first got into coaching 15 years ago, and I think about all of the coaches that I used to have, we never had enough rest in between anything. It was all gas, no breaks. It was the greatest amount of fatigue accumulation. And if athletes, whether it was myself or the team I was on, or even, again, like I said, when I first started off as coaching, if my athletes weren't huffing and puffing, bent over and just exhausted, I didn't think we did anything. Okay. That couldn't be so much further from the truth that if you take away anything and you're doing speed training, make sure you have full recovery. Okay. There are charts. I didn't have it in this, but there are charts that will talk to you about, hey, what's the most adequate rest time per yardage that I should focus on with my athletes. I'll take that a little bit further and just understand that not every athlete falls within a chart. So you have to be the good coach that you are and understand, hey, are my athletes, after they're done doing a 20-yard sprint and they walk back, are they still huffing and puffing? Did we hit the time that we usually try to do from a rest perspective, and they're still looking a little pale, they're still looking a little gassed? Maybe we should give them a little bit more. Give them a little bit more time. Now, you got to be reasonable because obviously you only have 10 to 15 minutes, but maybe you do a little less volume. Instead of doing 5 total reps, maybe you do 4. You're still getting that exposure, though. That's the most important piece. So this last one, how I'm using it, it's pretty much all that I've just talked about right now, especially with that first block, or that's first bullet point, right? A block is some form of acceleration, max velo, depending on time of year and partnership with coaches. The biggest thing is that no single session carries a high load or volume, right? Again, biggest takeaway, no single session carries a high load or volume, and speed quality is maintained year round. Probably second biggest takeaway, right? If you can fit a specific outcome that's super positive in a coach's constraint, a time constraint, and we can identify the fact that it maintains the speed quality that these athletes have, keeps them healthier, keeps them faster, that's going to be able to be maintained year round. That's huge. That's significant. So just to sum up everything, this was microdosing from a team microdosing speed from a team sport environment. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email's at the bottom, my cell phone's at the bottom, some social media pages are at the bottom as well. If you follow me, you can take a look at some of the stuff that we do. I try and post as much content as I can. With my time constraints, if it's not easy for me, I probably don't do it, just with working with 11 different teams. So appreciate y'all. Let me talk to you today, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your day.